Welcome to Shock to the Series. In young forests at the dawn of time, plants were born with the ability to kill humans. Such simple, perfect organisms. Do you understand the meaning of such toxic flora? They demonstrate that all creation seeks an end to mankind. Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of Shock to the Series. On this episode, we're going to talk about a 4-game series that was Nintendo exclusive. First 2 games came out on DS. The next one came out on Wii, and then the Wii U eShop for the last one. And that is the Trauma Center series. This is Trauma Center Under the Knife 2, which was preceded by Under the Knife, and then those were succeeded by Second Opinion and Trauma Team. These games have you performing surgical operations. These were released in 2005. The story in them, however, took place in 2018. Haven't gotten as far as the game would have liked yet. A lot of these procedures and things don't unfortunately exist today still. But so you in Under Knife 2 and Second Opinion, you take on the role of Derek Stiles, a doctor who finds out that he has the power of the healing touch. It's also known as Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. And with this power, he's able to slow time, which helps him through surgeries when things are getting really rough. You can use this power once per surgery and maybe get yourself out of a tight spot. It's not so broken, though, because it doesn't last forever, and it is only usable once per surgery, except in the finale, which I'll get to in a minute. But Derek ends up working for the big organization of the games known as Caduceus USA. And slowly he starts to encounter these weird viruses in people. And these turn out to be something called guilt. It's this bio virus that is attacking people, and there are several different strains that show up, and it's causing these massive problems because it's something they've never seen before. And we find out it's being created by this organization known as Delphi, and Delphi is just being terrible, trying to infect everyone, make everyone sick. And in the end, what we find is that the man behind Delphi is a man known as Adam, aka Eric Von right now, the guy who did the quote at the beginning, and he is tired of humanity, basically, and humanity always inventing things to kill themselves, basically. So he's created these guilt, which kind of represent sins, also, and there's a lot in these. Like I'm barely brushing the edges of these stories. There's Derek's assistant Angie, whose father is part of Delphi. Derek and Angie's relationship starts off a little strained, but in the end they become lovers, basically. And Under the Knife 2 is set 3 years later, 3 years from now, in this present 2021, and there's a post-guilt syndrome, which infects people who had guilt and causes them problems. And then there's also these strains of neo-guilt, which are being developed by the HOA, the Hands of Asclepius. There's also Delphi showing back up with more guilt. And the Hands of Asclepius, the guy was developing it to try to cure his wife in a sort of Mr. Freeze vibe. He wants to find a cure for his wife who's in a coma. He develops this neo-guilt as a performance enhancer, which allows these doctors to use the healing touch, but also completely makes them almost robotic, and almost a little too much. Second Opinion was basically a remake of Under the Knife with the added story of Naomi Kimishima, who's a doctor in her own right, but at the start she's working for Delphi without knowing, and of course in the end she does realize that everything's wrong. She goes with you, but she has to stay in Europe to not be charged for anything she did while with Delphi. And then we move to Trauma Team, which is kind of completely different. There's no guilt, there's no post-guilt, there's no anything, there's no neo-guilt, none of that. What we get instead is a different setup where instead of being Derek Styles, you are 6 different people. You are Naomi. She's come back for this working as a forensics person. She goes to places and says, okay, what is here? I could infect them. Why, she looks at bodies and says, okay, what does this mean? You have your basic surgeon who is a wrongly convicted criminal, turns out. Don't want to get too much into story spoilers here. Again, there's a lot to get through, but it just turns out he's wrongly convicted, and he also has the healing touch power, as these protagonists do. Um, you have a doctor of endoscopy, you have an orthopedic surgeon, you have a diagnostician, you have an EMT. And you play through all their stories, and they all end up interconnecting at the end as we find out about this new virus that's causing viral hemorrhagic fever in patients, and it's the Rosalia virus. And the big thing about this one is that Naomi has a terminal illness, and she ends up getting infected by Rosalia. This is kind of the last thing. The Rosalia merges with this virus and becomes Twisted Rosalia, and you have to save her from the Twisted Rosalia. These games were a challenge. Even on like normal mode, you really had to just be patient, be ready, make sure you knew where to cut, make sure you knew when to heal, make sure you knew when to use all the tools at your disposal, including the healing touch, because it wasn't just this instant cure. If you use it at the wrong time, especially on Under the Knife, the last boss, the final form of guilt is known as Sabato. If you use healing touch too early, then you will not be able to use it 2 times in a row later on in that fight, which will completely stop time, as opposed to just slowing it down. Basically, it's not strong. The Sabato is too strong to be really affected by the healing touch just slowing time down, so you have to do it twice. And the idea here is that it puts a strain on Derek, which is why you can only do it so often and for so long. So if you mistime it and you use it early, it actually is almost impossible to finish the mission, if not actually physically impossible. The music for these games is great. The Twisted Rosalia theme is one of my favorites to just listen to. It's really good music. I love the stories, kind of the twists and turns, and I love these different looks at humanity, and these deep thought bad guys. Not just I want to take over the world, but these bad guys who are so convinced they're right, who are so convinced that mankind is their own worst enemy. And you look at the world today, and it's honestly a fairly accurate statement. We are our own worst enemy sometimes, and it's amazing, honestly, that the world is in as decent a shape it's in, because it could be worse, it could be better, it could be worse. But I really think these games, especially with the technology that's available to us now, and like the Switch, if you keep it Nintendo, just deserve one more chance. Let's get back into that. It was fun. It was frustrating. You're graded from C to S in these games, on these missions, on these surgeries, and getting a C, you still pass. It's one of those, you passed, but did you really? You just barely. So you want to do better. And there's all kinds of post missions, which I never completed because I was okay. I was pretty good, but as it just gets tougher, I don't have the reflexes I'd like to have to deal with the post game stuff, because it is absolutely ridiculous having to deal with these diseases in these forms. Of course, none of these are real. It's all made up stuff, nothing that exists, nothing that I think could really exist. But I think these games are a really interesting example of just good games that aren't attached to a pre-existing character, aren't something that you don't have to have a lot of action and violence and things like that. It's not a fighter, it's not an action adventure game. It's an intense surgical sort of simulation, but it really works. So again, as per usual, you guys hopefully know the drill by episode 3. Poll up here: should the Trauma Center series come back for one more operation, or should we call it here? That's it for this one, guys. On the next one, I'm going to cover another little DS title, and I hope you guys will come and see it. That's Lights Out on Shock to the Series Trauma Center.